Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like to talk about US presidents, and I did an earlier video talking about the emergence and the evolution of our political parties. I did not delve into their dogmas or their different ideologies and principles. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to try and talk about the different underlying principles, philosophies, and the dogma of these different parties as our nation evolved. At the beginning, as I said before, we didn't have political parties. Our founding president, George Washington, he did not like partisanship, and he thought it was something that was dreadful. It was a threat to the nation. So we didn't have political parties. However, we already had divergent uh, thinking, philosophies, and this was constituted in his initial cabinet. The two major camps that developed were led by Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, and his protege, James Madison, who was a congressman at the time. He also went on to become uh, the fourth US president. Now, Alexander Hamilton, what did he stand for? Now, he wanted a strong central government, right? A very strong central government. He wanted uh, he wanted an economy that was based uh, on international trade, banking, and manufacturing. He wanted a strong national army. Okay, the national army thing, they didn't really conflict regarding this at the beginning, but on the other hand, you'd see that Thomas Jefferson and his camp, they wanted uh, they focused more on state militias. They didn't want a standing army. That wasn't important because they still had this threat of Britain and Europe, and they were a nascent, a new uh, country, and so that wasn't such a it wasn't such a polarizing a point at that time. But importantly, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they wanted more of an agrarian economy. They thought farmers, a rural economy, that it was best embodied. It best embodied the notion of independent Americans and liberty. Uh, they wanted to focus more on, as they said, where the common man. When I'm talking about the common man, of course, we're not going to talk about the slave holding and their rights. That's not what they were focused on at the time. But they didn't want a strong central government. They emphasized what they called their states' rights at the time. So, uh, nevertheless, in spite of these differences, the first major deal was made with a compromise of 1790. So, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they met with their nemesis, Alexander Hamilton, and they agreed on something. Alexander Hamilton, who wanted to build a national bank. That was part of his ideology. He wanted to build a national bank that would be the depository of the federal funds, and he also wanted to do something he called the assumption of state debts. Right, the cost of the Revolutionary Wars was, it was a burden on the distinct colonies, which became the states. However, some states had already paid off their debts, like Virginia. And Alexander Hamilton figured that if the federal government were to assume the debts of the states, it will make the federal government very strong, and it will also help build national credit. So this was something that he was emphasizing, and he was focused on having the national bank as well. So they reached a compromise, and at the beginning of our democracy, the federal capital was in New York, right? Now, New York was also the financial capital. So this was a deal, the concession Andrew Alexander Hamilton made. They would create a new federal capital, and it would be in the South. Yes, Washington, D.C. So it was carved out of Virginia and Maryland, both in the South. In exchange, they would accept the assumption of state debts and the creation of the National Bank. So that was a compromise of 1790. And so that's why we have the capital in Washington, D.C., and not in New York. New York remained the financial capital, uh, where the bankers were. Something else that Alexander Hamilton wanted to do was, of course, he wanted to create issue bonds, right, for the debts that the federal government was assuming to be able to sell them, as securities. And so, these were the major uh, divergent views that created our first two political parties. And Alexander Hamilton's camp, as I mentioned earlier, was a Federalist Party, and the Anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republican Party, as it was also known as, was the party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, fast forward. Uh, Now we get into the era of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had started as a Federalist like his father, John Adams, but with time, he moved over to the Democratic Republican Party. Now, this was what was called the era of good feelings, when the Democratic Republican Party was virtually the only party that existed. It didn't have any rivals, and so Alexander Hamilton had his own views, and later on, this manifested in new political parties. There was the Whig Party. There was uh, the Whig Party came as a result of their views were they were against the popularity and the strength of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was called King Andrew the First. They were saying, look, he was so powerful. He was like a monarch. He was going to be a dictator, an absolutist. And so the Whig Party, they came up as they were their symbol was the Whig Party in England, which was against the monarchy. And so that was the Whig Party, and they were, opposites in opposition to the Democratic Republican Party, which eventually, it splintered. And of course, they had the Jacksonian Democrats, the Democratic Party of of the Jacksonian era. Uh, Andrew Jackson's Democrats were more populist, minded. They emphasized states' rights. Uh, Now, let's go back to John Quincy Adams. So, John Quincy Adams was emphasizing something called internal improvements, right? So, he was largely in support of what Alexander Hamilton believed in. Alexander Hamilton's views came to be known as the American system, right? So, a strong central government, strong army, uh, John Quincy Adams would advocate for the development, the building of the Navy, a strong Navy and fortifications. But he was also emphasizing something called internal improvements, that the federal government should fund internal improvements. And internal improvements was the name they called, uh, was the designation they gave infrastructure projects like building of harbors, roads, and things that they thought, the transportation system that they thought would further unite the the geography, the physical geography of the country. So Andrew, however, the Democratic Republican Party were opposed to this. They thought internal improvements should be the purview of the states, not the federal government. So internal improvements was something that John Quincy Adams was interested in, and of course, it mushroomed into a number of different parties as well. Now, something else that they now started to uh, that was an issue with them was the issue of tariffs, right? Tariffs. So you see, people, um, the Federalists and those who came a little bit after them and were similar, like the Whigs Party, the National Republican Party, many of these people wanted tariffs. They wanted high tariffs. So if they uh, levied high tariffs, they felt it was a source of revenue for the federal government, and it would also protect domestic manufacturing, right? The manufacturing industries were in the north, the northeast. Again, the South, they were agrarian. Now, the Democratic Republican Party, the people who supported Thomas Jefferson and the progeny in ideology, they were against high tariffs because they were used to buying imported goods from Europe, right? They bought textiles, finished goods from Europe, and they wanted, cheaper prices. And the other thing is because their produce were agricultural products, right? Uh, and cotton, they felt that Europe would retaliate if they levied high tariffs on their goods. Europe would retaliate with by raising tariffs on their products as well. That was one. So the Democratic Republican Party and the Democrats were against high tariffs, which the Federalists and those who came after them in the manner of Whigs Party and National Republicans, they were for high tariffs, and eventually, of course, the Republican Party. So tariffs was an issue. Something else was the currency, right? The currency. So the Democrats were for what's called free silver. Free silver was uh, they wanted to be able to uh, coin silver into unlimited coinage of silver, and for money on demand, right? So this would cause inflation. So they wanted an expansionary monetary system in the South, that is, because of the agrarian economy that they had. They wanted inflation deliberately because if the value of the money went down, they had loans they were owing to British bankers, and they thought that it would make it easy for them to repay their loans, with inflated money, as opposed to, so that's what the those who were on the agrarian side of the political party system, those who focused on the agrarian economy, the Democratic Republican Party and the Democrats, they wanted free silver, free money, as opposed to those who wanted the gold standard, right? So the Republicans, the Federalists, they wanted the gold standard. The Whig Party, they wanted the gold standard. Gold standard was basically the currency in circulation was fixed to a specific quantity of gold, right? And this was something that they wanted. It was something that the New York bankers wanted. It was also something that it was equivalent. It was transferable internationally. It was what European bankers wanted as well. And of course, this was a time of the railway expansion, right? The expansion in the railroads to westward. Now, the railroads, the entrepreneurs, the tycoons, they wanted the money to be tied to the gold standard. Besides, the federal government was also um, was providing land grants and bonds. And the federal government had this rule then that they would not allow new purchases of land westward uh, without the currency being backed by gold. So they wanted the money to be easily converted to gold, which was something that the agrarian South did not want. The agrarian South wanted free silver, inflated money to make the value of their loans, uh, you know, go down so that they can easily repay back their loans to the bankers in Europe, in London. So these were some of the major differences that the political parties had. Now, also over time, uh, they differed in terms of expansion of territories, right? Now, there was something called the Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, this was the belief that America was supposed to have its boundaries on the west, by the Atlantic Ocean and on the east by the Pacific Ocean. So they wanted to keep expanding westward. So that was the manifest destiny belief, right? And so you could see they went into several wars. They went into the Mexican American War. They, continued to try to, seize land following the initial Louisiana purchase under Thomas Jefferson. So, and the ability to access uh, new territories westward erased the thorny issue of slavery, right? At the beginning of our republic, around 1820, there was something called the Missouri Compromise. And so this was an agreement that there would be some kind of balance between the North and South. The North and South were free states, they didn't allow slavery. And so the South, of course, was slaveholding. And the idea, there was now the issue of, okay, when they were expanding westward, would these new states be slaveholding? The Missouri Compromise did not allow that, but by 1850, there was something new that they did. There was a compromise of 1850, which sort of did away with the Missouri Compromise, and basically what it did was it allowed something called free sovereignty, popular sovereignty, which allowed the new states to decide if they wanted to have slavery or not. Now, this was something that the North didn't like because they thought that it was breaking an initial agreement. And so, as they kept expanding westward, some generals like Zachary Taylor, he didn't move. He wasn't president for long. He was president for just about a year. Zachary Taylor, he believed at the time that, well, even though he was a slave owner, he supported, slavery. He was a slave owner himself. I think he was from Louisiana or so. Um, but he believed that the westward expansion was not amenable, that the lands in the West were not amenable to owning because of the soil. Now, of course, when they expanded further west into California with the Alta California Purchase, following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo under President James Knox Polk. His name is James Polk. Sometimes I make a mistake and I just call him President James Knox, but that's James Polk. Um, he, you know, under James Knox Polk, they sort of uh, there was a crisis. There was a crisis regarding uh, the slave ownership. There were several crises that came up later on. There was uh, the was it was called the Kansas Nebraska crisis, where there was the issue of popular sovereignty. So the issue of slaveholding was very it was contentious, and so this was it was now manifesting in the development of new political parties. So a political party that was coming up, they were the abolitionists, right? And many of them were moving into the uh, the anti-slavery party, that's the Republican Party, which and their first successful president was uh, President Abraham Lincoln. There was a guy before him. His name was Fremont, and he didn't win. He was a candidate for presidency, but he didn't win. But eventually, President Abraham Lincoln did become president, and of course, that was precipitated the secession of the South and the Civil War. So over time, when slavery was done with, they continued. By this time, the two parties had really crystallized. Right, the ideologies had sort of evolved into these two main parties: the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was anti-slavery. They were for uh, a very strong central government. They supported the gold standard, uh, and of course, the Democratic Party, they were still more agrarian. There was so slavery was no longer an issue. So they continued to evolve. Now, later on, There was also the expansionist interest, um, the and the issue of tariffs. That's McKinley. He was known as a tariff man, and so they wanted to continue raising tariffs because they thought if they raised tariffs, it would protect industries in the north, the northern industries, and of course the Democratic Party was against raising of tariffs, and of course there was a party under Jackson. Actually, it was founded by his. It was the main guy anyway in the party was his vice president who had to resign. That was John C. Calhoun. They're called the nullifiers, right? They were the ones who said that if the state believed that the federal government had made an unconstitutional law, they could invalidate it, just say it was null and void. And so there were the nullifiers, right? And this was the issue of tariffs. So you see, you heard of the tariffs of abomination. This was way back in 1828. It was signed initially by John Quincy Adams. So tariffs, the economy, these things, slavery, these things were issues that were that were causing friction and polarizing, our politics in the beginning. Now, now something I wanted to quickly talk about, apart from the ideologies, there was something that was very salient in our parties. There was the party bosses. So our parties started off. They were really. There was a lot of corruption in our political parties. So there were these people who were called party bosses, right? There's an interest that was called the Tammany Hall bosses. That was in New York, and that was a democratic machinery. Of course, they were unsavory. They were led by unsavory characters, and they decided who was going to be a candidate. And so this was also something. It wasn't just unique to New York. It also it manifested in other sections of the country as well. The South had their party bosses. Pennsylvania, they had their party bosses. But the most influential, the most known was the Tammany Hall bosses, which, were in New York. So my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about uh, US presidents. Of course, today I've just tried to delve into some of the different views that led to the doctrines that led that were causing, that were polarizing our nation and led to the development of political parties. Now, sorry, one party I wanted to quickly talk about was the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was a nativist party. They're also called an American party. They were called known. So they were very anti-immigrant. They were anti-Catholic at the time. Millard Fillmore had been a known party member. Millard Fillmore, of course, had become a president with the death of Zachary Taylor. So the Know Nothings, why were they called Know Nothings? Because they were supposed to have their, their, their party, their meetings under so much secrecy. And if anybody asked them anything, they'd say, I do not know anything. I know nothing. So they're called the Know Nothing political party. So so we had a number of very funny political parties that came up. There were the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers eventually emerged into what became known as uh, the Republican Party. So again, expansion and the issue of slavery. These were things that drove, our, the development of our political parties and caused our dogma, our doctrines to evolve. And as I've mentioned earlier, many times some of our candidates, there are some of, when they became president, uh, as a matter of expedience, they would sometimes uh, contradict in action what their stated doctrines were. Even Andrew Jackson did this, right? Andrew Jackson had believed in states' rights and all that, but he turned out to be a very strong-willed president who centralized power, who made the federal government very, very powerful, and he to the surprise of a lot of people who had voted him. So my name is Olu Osha. I've been I've been framed in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I've been doing videos. The case number is C15CR230000731. I've suffered an abusive process, and I'm looking forward to justice, and I'll keep you posted.